Hello everyone. We've got a really exciting talk for you today, and I think it's going to be an exciting one for a number of different reasons, one of which is we're going to educate you on peatlands, for those of you that don't know about peatlands, so something different from AI today, which might be good. We're also going to talk to you about the importance of how research had impact at EU's policy change level, and then the impact that could have on an environmental level, or will have on an environmental level and global level. So we hope it's important for a number of different reasons, and it hopefully is going to be exciting for you guys as well. So what did we do? We tried to reposition an unsung climate hero to instigate policy change. So what we're talking about here is peatlands, and I'm going to hand over to Tierney in a second, who's going to talk us through peatlands, because they don't always have the best press and they don't always have the best rep, but what we tried to do is change their perceptions because we think they could be really powerful, and this had some really good impact in the long run and showed where research can be useful. So I'll hand over to Tierney now.
Great, thank you, Nick. So talking about peatlands. Peatlands are a type of wetland that are found in pretty much every country around the world. They only make up about 3% of global land surface, but they can have a disproportionate impact, but that can be either positive or negative. So healthy peatlands are a huge climate champion. They have the potential to store twice as much carbon as all of the world's forests combined. So we talk about forests a lot, but actually peatlands could be a bigger champion than forests when it comes to climate change. They also have other critical services. They filter our drinking water, and they are a natural defence against things like floods, droughts, and wildfires. But at the moment, our peatlands are overexploited through activities such as drainage, conversion to agricultural land, and mining for fuel. And this has left them really degraded, and degraded peatlands not only don't store carbon, but they actually emit it in large quantities. So in fact, at the moment, global peatlands are responsible for about 5% of global carbon emissions every year. But we faced a bit of a challenge when it comes to peatlands, and that's that peatlands just aren't sexy. For the majority of us, we actually don't know what peatlands are, and where we do know what they are, we see them as bogs or swamps, these kind of eerie, foreboding landscapes that are to be feared. They're often the backdrop for things like horror movies and thrillers. They're seen as isolated, desolate, the perfect place to hide a crime. None of this is really helping peatlands' reputation. But in the climate community, we faced another challenge as well, which is that a huge amount of peatlands are being turned over to agricultural land. And in Europe, a lot of our countries have huge heritage and roots in agriculture, and we have a very strong agricultural lobby. So this was even before we think about the fact that things like the cost of living crisis and the war in Ukraine have brought issues such as energy and food security to the forefront. And this has given those opposition voices a real powerful narrative to tap into, even though actually if you look at the body of evidence, there's a growing body of evidence that healthy peatlands are a net positive for things like food security. So we face this twin challenge. How do we counter these kind of dominant opposing voices when ultimately not many people actually know what peatlands are, which is why we turn to Walnut.
Okay, so yeah, how did we reposition them? Now we're going to get into a bit of the research, as we are at a research conference, so we'll get stuck into a bit of this. But we basically used neuroscience and behavioural science in a number of different ways, and we basically used it to help us leverage and revamp sustainability messaging. So within our study, what did we do? Just to run through some details, as this will set up almost the rest of the presentation. So we did some quantum qual research in Germany and Finland, as these are quite two differing markets when it comes to peatlands. They have almost different contexts of why they're important for each of those countries. Within the quantitative testing, which I'm going to talk about in quite a lot of detail in a second, we used implicit reaction time testing. So that's almost the element of neuroscience we included. And then we crafted this messaging playbook. So after we did all of our research, we built this playbook of how peatlands should be messaged and how environmental causes almost should be messaged, which was delivered to over 120 comms, policy and campaign professionals in a big webinar that seemed to be very successful, because the end result of all of this is we impacted an EU law, which we're going to take you through at the end, just to show how this consumer research really had that great impact. So let's delve in a little bit of what happened. So our main aim with this was to understand what would drive people to support peatlands more, what would motivate them to almost take action, and then off the back of that, we could understand what types of messages we should use. So what we did was we tried to employ, or we did employ, neuroscience, and that's for a number of different reasons. So we know that effective communication works better when it's emotional. We know that advertising that's more emotional works better. And we know that when we're thinking about brands and we're also thinking about driving action, tapping into the emotional side of our brain is really important. That's because many of our decisions are not made by our rational brain, they're made by our emotional brain. So we needed to delve a little bit deeper. We needed to dive into some of the neuroscience and try use implicit techniques where we could. So what we did with our quantitative testing and this implicit testing is we tried to go beyond verbal declarations, and we basically used something called the attitude accessibility paradigm, which basically means the quicker that you respond to something, the quicker you can access an attitude. It's meant to be a stronger guide of behavior. So if you're asking someone a question and they respond with a fast reaction time, we could say that they say it, but they also really mean it. There's that emotional conviction behind their response. So when we were looking at our results, we weren't just looking at those people that agreed with the statement, whether it would motivate them. We looked at their speed of response, as that almost gives us that implicit response, that emotional response behind their declaration. So if we only look at explicit scores, we almost miss the bigger picture. And when we show you the results in a second, if we just stayed at our explicit traditional metrics, we maybe don't get the full picture of what we're doing. So at the top of this, you can see how we ask the question to people. So that's an example statement there saying healthy peatlands reduce the effects of climate change. And we got people to indicate just yes or no, whether it would help them to motivate them to support peatlands more. And when we looked at the results, or we give some example results of these two people here, they're both agreeing with that response. So on a conscious, rational level, they're both agreeing with the response, which is all well and good. However, it doesn't give us the full picture. Once we overlay our implicit testing and look at the speed of response for this, we can actually see how many of those have said it and are truly convinced by what they've said. So this top one out of the two there, you can say that they say it and they really mean it. There's almost that emotional conviction behind their response. So when we were looking at our results, we didn't want to just rely on what people say on the surface. We needed to delve a little bit deeper and try to look at that implicit response we have there, because these people are agreeing with it, but maybe there's some hesitation, which shows there's not that same, or you can't access the attitude as quickly. So we're focused on those fast yes responses when we get to the results. Just one piece of, or further piece of information when it comes to how we structured the study. We spoke to those that were already concerned with climate change. Luckily, this is a fair amount of the population, so within these two countries. So it was an open audience, but within the two countries we spoke to, I think it was around 60–70% of people that said they are concerned by climate change, which I guess is a good thing, but maybe should be a little bit more. And we also brought everyone up to a baseline, so we gave people an almost baseline knowledge about peatlands to counteract the fact that some people maybe wouldn't have that same level of knowledge, which enabled us to understand really what would be driving their motivation. So what did we test and what were actually going into some of the results? And we said before that maybe peatlands weren't sexy, but hopefully after going through all of these different motivators, we can maybe understand why they're so important. I think Tierney's already done a good job of explaining to you why they're important to our world. But we developed a list of overarching themes, and within those we had statements. So we did a big immersion session with peatland experts and environmentalist experts, and we could see that one of our themes was climate change mitigation, and you could see a couple of the types of statements that were involved in that. We also had climate change resilience, which is slightly different in terms of minimising the things like flood risk and wildfires. We also looked into clean water, because in some of the markets we were speaking to, peatlands have a really strong role in terms of providing clean water. Support for wildlife, and this is one that's going to be quite interesting as we move forward, but within peatlands there's a lot of rare animals, there's a lot of rare plants. Sometimes they don't have, maybe one of the reasons why they often don't have the same perception is they don't have cute monkeys and stuff, but they do have amazing plants, and they do have really cool animals and birds and things like that. So that's one of the topics we explored. And then the final two within these are more within the human side of things. So we looked at human benefits, so looking at the impact on rural economies. Tierney's already touched on things like food security, which are a really difficult conversation when you're trying to get to persuade people to take more environmental actions, but obviously there's basic needs and things like food security to counteract as well. And then the final one, Tierney touched on it as well, is in terms of this identity and heritage. Lots of peatlands are archaeological sites, or they're in terms of natural heritage sites, so we have to be mindful of those things. So, jumping to the results, we're looking now just here at the rational results that we had on this. So these are just the explicit results that we had, and we can see in this that we had super high scores across the board, which is a good thing. It shows that people were motivated and were wanting to support peatlands. And we can see that climate change mitigation there with 93% was the strongest performing one. On a rational level, it makes sense. When you're talking to people about peatlands and you're giving these amazing facts, for example, they could hold double the amount of CO2 as all the world's forests combined, that's a really motivating factor. However, when we overlaid our implicit testing and we looked at the emotional side of things, we got a slightly different story. And this is how we started to build our messaging testing. So when we see these implicit reactions, so what we've got along the bottom here is the dotted lines, our threshold for what we'd say is a strong score or a good score. We can see that there's some changes with the blue line, which is our implicit scores. And actually, the strongest performing out of these themes was support for wildlife, with climate change mitigation almost dropping to our lowest performing out of each of those statements. And that doesn't mean that we should dismiss climate change mitigation, but it also means that when you're talking to someone like a subject like environmental causes, sometimes the facts and figures about climate change mitigation aren't always the most motivating thing. They're not emotional, and they aren't maybe as tangible, and they don't hook us in. So what we just said to people, or what we said when we were looking at our messaging playbook, is that we need to lead with something that draws people in. And wildlife is fairly tangible for people. It resonates with us, it connects with us. It almost brings out the protector in us. And when I was thinking about this, I almost thought back to when we would have non-uniform days at school or mufti days, and we'd be giving for Save the Donkeys or something, or a charity similar to that, which seems a little bit funny when you look back on it now. But it shows how wildlife almost attracts our attention. When you look at any charity campaign, wildlife are at the forefront of that. Cute animals do draw us in. So when we looked at almost the way that we should tackle this, we said that we need to think about the conscious side of things and also maybe the emotional side of things. So on a rational level, climate change mitigation is super important and dominates the discussion. However, when we looked at the emotional side of things, support for wildlife resonated the most. So what did we do in terms of our recipe for success? So within this, we had our 4 steps that went into our playbook, which was delivered to the guys at Climate Catalyst, which they're going to show you the impact of in a second. But our number 1 step, or the first step for this, is start with something tangible, something that resonates with people. We know that this wildlife theme can deliver that emotional value for people. We then moved on to having something more tailored and relevant. So once you've almost got people's engagement, then you can deliver something that's a bit more relevant to them, or maybe relevant to the market, because in our 2 markets of Finland and Germany, we saw quite different things that would motivate people. And then the third one is deliver some almost surprising facts or something that might entice people further. So it's that age-old thing of once you've got people's attention, how can you almost maintain that? How can you bring in some of the other facts? So things like, I didn't know that peatlands store more carbon than the world's forests, can be a really good thing to almost draw people in and take them further. And then the final point, or the 4th step for this, was keeping a positive tone. And we've not really focused on this that much within this presentation, but we actually tested a number of different statements, some of which were positively orientated and some which were negatively orientated. And we found that the positively orientated statements were always more effective. We've done quite a lot of environmental research at Walnut, and we often talk about providing hope for people. Lots of the climate change or lots of the environmental story is about the doom and gloom, and providing people hope motivates people even more. So rather than just saying all the things that are going wrong, providing that hope can be really powerful. And then across the bottom of this, we said, as I guess with all advertising, marketing, be consistent, be simple with your messaging, make it easy to understand for people, and then help them to connect the dots. So this was almost our plan of how to message with peatlands, but also environmental causes in general. So I'm now going to pass over to Tierney to talk through what impact that had.
Great, thank you, Nick. Can you go to the next slide? Sorry.
Oh.
So in terms of our impact, as Nick mentioned, a lot of our work focused on creating this messaging playbook. And that was really important to us at Climate Catalyst, because we have a firm commitment that's kind of built into our model at Climate Catalyst of providing longer term impact for our partners. So we wanted to provide them with a tool that was easy accessible, and that they didn't need to have necessarily gone through the research process with us or have kind of the context that we had going into this, but it was just a tool that they could easily use, whether they were kind of environmental experts, climate experts, peatlands experts, completely new to this topic, or seasoned campaigners. And we were actually able to go and deliver the playbook and the underlying research to, as Nick said, 120 individuals from the NGO community across Europe, which was really exciting. And it was actually our most popular learning event to date at Climate Catalyst, which shows that there is a real kind of demand for this sort of research within this space. And as you can see from the slide, many of those organisations are already now taking this and using it with their work. So this is a quote from one of our partners, the Gwijseld Meyer Centre. They are one of the global experts on peatlands, and they're very much already being able to embed this within the work that they're doing. We were also able to share this research kind of further and wider. We shared it within networks we had working specifically on nature restoration in Europe, as well as globally with partners through the Global Peatlands Initiative. So it went beyond Europe. And it was also distributed at a Power to the Peatlands conference in Belgium in last year, which was a gathering of civil society, academia, policymakers all working on this issue. So all of this together shows that this is now in the toolkit of civil society organisations, academic organisations and policy advocacy organisations across Europe, which is very exciting for us. But what does this mean in terms of policy and the policy impact we're able to have? Well, we started conducting this research with Walnut when we were working as part of a coalition of organisations trying to advocate for a strong nature restoration law in Europe. The law sets out targets for all member states to protect various ecosystems, and one of those within the law is peatlands. But as I said, we're facing some real opposition in terms of that law, and particularly the peatlands target within it. And while we were able to go about continually to debunking these claims around food security in peatlands, for example, we didn't have the same kind of emotive response. We couldn't tap into the same emotive arguments that those opposing the law were able to tap into. But thanks to this research, we've now been able to collectively work to reframe that issue. And very excitingly, just 2 weeks ago now, the law was passed by the European Parliament, so the nature restoration law has now been passed and it's set to be adopted by the European Council later this year. But for us, sadly, that means that the work is only just beginning. There's still a long way to go. So once we have the law adopted at the European Council, it's now going to turn to national governments to think about how that translates into national level policy. So all of our partners at national level are now going home with this new law and figuring out what that means in their individual countries. But really, luckily, thanks to this research, they're now armed with a really strong evidence-based narratives and frames that they can use to continue to push this work and to push their policymakers to go, to meet the level of ambition within the nature restoration law or potentially even go beyond it, which is very exciting. And we ourselves have actually already started to be able to embed this piece of work in a public awareness campaign that we've been running in Germany with Gwijseld Meyer Centre, who I spoke about earlier, and another partner, which is now already being able to reach millions of people to be able to talk to them about the importance of healthy peatlands, both for the environment and for society more generally. So that's very exciting. But we actually think that this research could go beyond that as well. As I mentioned before, it's being shared with global partners through initiatives like the Global Peatlands Initiatives, and we think that there's a lot there that organisations in other countries can also take and adapt to their national context. We obviously looked at 2 countries and certain themes emerged from that were interesting, but it provides a really good basis to go and do more testing in different national contexts, which is very exciting. And we also think that it provides a really good basis for thinking about how we talk about other environmental topics as well, not just about peatlands. And for me personally, as a climate communicator, it also gives me great evidence to talk internally to my colleagues. By being able to talk to them about perhaps not always leading with our own priorities, so not always leading with climate change or carbon emissions, actually means that we can reach a wider public and bring them along on this kind of journey to impact.
Cool. So hopefully you've seen from all of that and the impact that Tierney just talked through how our consumer research helped to embolden Climate Catalyst, and that's something that we almost want to get across with this is we've hopefully taken you on a nice journey with peatlands, but it's a really good example of how consumer research can have an impact at a number of different levels, all the way up to EU level, which hopefully, or as we know now, has passed the law through. So we hope that you've enjoyed hearing about it, and this is a great story about the power of insight. So thank you.
Thank you. I love the, what was it called, the conference again?
Power of the peatlands.
Power of the peatlands. Indirect competition with the rainforests.
Yeah, well, you know.
Yeah.
Both equally important.
Both equally important. Yeah. So I wanted to open up for questions. I've got one here on Slido, an anonymous one, about how you build the attitude. I'll get this. It's easy for me to say. Attitude accessibility paradigm. Is it feasible on standard survey platforms? Is this going to be built in a default going forwards?
Yeah, we use it pretty much every day in terms of in our surveys. So at Walnut, I sit within our neuroscience team, and we do most of our work. We use implicit reaction time testing. It sits within our usual surveys, so it's very easily done, and we often talk to clients about how we feel it's important just to go beyond those verbal declarations, and it's fairly seamless in terms of how it sits within there. So if anyone wants to talk to me about reaction time testing, we can do that after.
Yeah, good for you. Oh, loads of hands. It was a bit of a, yes, that lady in the white cardigan. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. It's really, really interesting. It'd be really good to hear about how neurodiversity fits into the kind of implicit research that you're doing, because I know my sister and mum are both autistic and take longer to process things, and we've done quite a lot of accessibility research in the client that I was working with over the last year, so it'd be really interesting to understand how that kind of fits into it as well. Yeah,
so when we do our implicit reaction time testing, everyone gets their own individual benchmark, so you do a whole calibration period where you answer a number of warm-up statements, and for that they're of varying different lengths, and your speed of response is almost calculated for that. So your fast reaction time is based on your own individual response. It's not like a general benchmark across everything. So it also counteracts for people of all different ages, as well as things like neurodiversities. We know that speed of response varies quite a lot.
Great. We had another one? Yeah, right. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have any reflections on the difference that context makes to people's responses to this? So you could imagine that while an emotional response to communication might be particularly pertinent when people are making a kind of like a relatively low stakes decision, you'd imagine that a stakeholder who's making a decision about like, policy decisions might be using a different framing, a different context. How does this sort of, how do you think about those different contextual factors?
Yeah, so I think we tried to take into account context with the 4 different steps in terms of knowing when the right type of message should be, because we didn't want this project also to say only focus on the emotional messages, because it's much broader than that. We know that on a rational level, there was really important things with a number of different other areas. So the guidance tried to take into account that context. I don't know if that's answered your question in the right way, but that's something we were trying to think about, is that when we do our implicit testing, we don't just disregard the explicit stuff, because when people have more time to think about a statement for something like peatlands that they don't know about, that their almost delayed response can still be important. So that's why we tried to balance the rational and the implicit and tried to give the recipe for success based on like multiple steps.
Great. Yeah, so you might as well just go there. And then we've got one over, yep, still, yeah, the one over there for that gentleman after that. And then I've got some from the iPad too.
Thank you, that's really interesting. Can you say a bit about the fieldwork, sample size, and whether you had any quotas for urban and rural locations?
Yeah, so I think we did 200 in each of the 2 samples, and we had, I think we'd had NatRep quotas on those, or fairly basic quotas. We didn't cut the data by rural versus urban. I think we were just trying to look at things from quite a broad perspective, as this campaign was trying to target everyone, but that would have been something really interesting to look into. One bit that we haven't gone into a lot of detail on this is that we also did qualitative groups, which really helped to obviously bring some of those points to life. So when asking people about peatlands and understanding some of these messages, the qualitative groups, as everyone knows, were really useful in terms of bringing some of that insight to life.
Okay, and this gentleman over there.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. I thought it was great. I know you didn't have time necessary to explore this loads, but I was interested in your observation about the difference between positive and negative messaging, and particularly whether you saw a difference in rational and emotional around those, and what that means for that playbook and how you're kind of rolling out that messaging as well.
Yeah, it's if we had more time, we probably would have gone into that, because there's almost a whole nother talk in terms of how to message people with positive and negative. And we do quite a lot of comms testing work at Walnut outside of the environmental sector, and it's still a topic we talk about quite a lot. I think even in things like within the insurance sector, there's often conversations about whether you talk about the concerns or issues that you're protecting people against and whether you have a positive or negative tone. We basically tested a whole load of statements, and some of those were, I think we did almost like a 50-50 split in terms of the ones that positively orientated and ones that were negatively, because I think it was a topic that you'd almost want to explore as well, is that within environmental causes, obviously, there's a lot of talk about the doom and gloom and the things that could go wrong, or maybe the things that are going wrong. So when we basically focused that story in terms of keeping a positive tone based on the fast yes responses. So on an emotional level, we saw the performance of the positive statements were stronger than the performance of those that were negatively orientated. So that's how we looked at those.
Great. Well, I've got two more questions, both on here on Slido. First of all, where you already were going in with a negative bias or negative attitudes on peatlands, and in particular the reasons behind those biases, and if not, how did you explore that?
Yeah, so definitely we're very aware of the negative bias. It was something that we've been kind of facing a lot in terms of a lot of the pushback and a lot of the kind of intense arguments around the nature restoration law were around specific ecosystems, and peatlands was one of them. And we knew roughly where some of those biases were coming from in terms of the voices and stuff that were bringing them up in terms of sort of agriculture and stuff like that. So I think what we really wanted to do with this piece of research is to figure out how to develop the right frames to counter some of those arguments. They were arguments that were coming up quite a lot in the press in kind of different events that we were attending in Brussels, and they were kind of dominating that space. And so for a lot of people kind of reading that, they're instantly getting, peatlands are terrible for food security, rather than necessarily getting the counter. So for us, it was very much about, we know that exists and we know we can debunk that, but actually a lot of our arguments weren't resonating. And why weren't our arguments resonating? And that's kind of why we wanted to look at, well, actually, are there completely different frames we should be focusing on, rather than just kind of reacting to those negative voices?
Yeah, great. And I've got one last one, lots of questions on implicit testing. So how do you determine the minimum good reaction time level?
How do you determine
the minimum good reaction time?
So we basically, everyone does their own individual benchmark, as I've already mentioned, and then that's measured against a whole host of other studies that we've done, and your response is taken in terms of, you get your individual benchmark for a fast yes score. But then in terms of that benchmark that we're talking about there, that's based off countless studies that we've done. So we actually did that benchmarks off quite a broad range of sectors, and we used that 40% as score. I think we did some analytics, and 75% of scores didn't score in that above 40% that we've across all the studies that we've done. So we use that benchmark as a strong score. We also have benchmarks of 20% as being like between 20 and 40 as an average score, and then anything above 50 being super high. So that support for wildlife almost got up to the benchmark for a 50%.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm going to be thinking very differently about peatlands from now on. Can we just thank Nick and Tony again? Thank you.